the Baen Free Radio Hour.
On the podcast, nerdy confab of physicists in dingy lab coats create time lump that throws reality back to the 1960s, when washing machines and dishwashers actually worked. But operatives of Big Bleach and the Borax Mule Drivers Union stage a raid to shut down the portal. Plus, we continue with the complete audiobook serialization of Larry Correia's Son of the Black Sword. All right now. Welcome to the Baen Free Radio Hour podcast. It's an honor to have you along. I'm Baen Senior Editor Tony Daniel. We have a great roundtable interview conducted by our sometime podcast co-host David Afsharirad this time, with authors of a great new anthology he edited, The Chronicles of Davids. Oh man, this is a good one, with stories filled with maximum Dave, as we like to say. You got it. It's stories that are by David Weber, David Drake, Gregory Benford and David Brin, David B. Coe, DJ Dave Butler, Avram Davidson, David H. Keller, and a cover by David Mattingly. You get the idea. David Afsharirad talks with DJ Butler, David Boop, David B. Coe, and David Hardy about the anthology. And we continue with the complete audiobook serialization of Larry Correia's great high fantasy novel, Son of the Black Sword. Now here's the news. The October e-arcs are whizzing out over the reading landscape like ghosts released from an exploding ecto-containment unit. Now, an e-arc is the cry of a ghost when it realizes it doesn't have any feet but tapers to a point that it must attempt to anchor in the beliefs of the superstitious-minded. No, that's not right. An e-arc is an electronic advanced reading copy of a book. It's an e-book that is a galley of a book to come, not proofread, but copy-edited, and you can get the new book in your favorite series or author or try out a new author months in advance of the print and e-book release dates. It's huge fun to know the future, or at least that delightful little chunk provided by a Baen e-arc. The October e-arcs include Gunpowder and Embers by John Ringo, Casey Ezel, and Christopher L. Smith. From the Embers of a Destroyed World. 30 years ago, the world ended. Giant electrovoric ants and pteranodons came through a rift. In space-time, millions of humans died, and that was that. 30 years later, humanity is rebuilt, sort of. Human ingenuity has provided some creative solutions to life without electricity because those ants are still around, but most folks survive at the subsistence level, farming to keep themselves and their families fed. Into this world comes a lifelong cowboy, a mystic warrior monk, a beautiful dragon tamer, a runaway cultist, and a mysterious drunken lecher, all searching for the key to reclaiming humanity's future from humanity's past. Also out now is Penrick's Progress e-arc by Lois McMaster Bujold. Welcome a new fantasy hero from Lois McMaster Bujold. On the way to his betrothal, young Lord Penrick happens upon a riding accident and stops to help. But the victim is no ordinary woman. She is a temple divine, servant to the 5 gods of this world. Her avowed god is the bastard, master of all disasters out of season. As she lies dying, she passes her strange powers to Penrick and changes the course of his life forever. Follow Penrick on his journey from noble young lord to sorcerer and scholar in the Bastard's Order. This one contains the novellas Penrick's Demon, Penrick and the Shaman, and Penrick's Fox. And now available in e-arc format is Frozen Orbit by Patrick Childs. The beginning of life at the end of the solar system. About to embark on NASA's first expedition to the outer planets, the crew of the spacecraft Magellan learns something else has beaten them by a few decades, a top-secret Soviet project named Archangel. It was a mission that began before most of them were even born, and the Kremlin believes it drove their most trusted crew mad. During their long race to the Kuiper Belt, astronauts Jack Templeton and Tracy Keane unwind a decades-long mystery buried in the pages of a dead cosmonaut's journal. Challenging their beliefs about the nature of humanity, they will soon confront the question of existence itself. Earc's Frozen Orbit by Patrick Childs, Penrick's Progress by Lois McMaster Bujold, and Gunpowder and Embers by John Ringo. Casey Ezel and Christopher L. Smith are available exclusively at Baen.com. Go to the Baen.com website, go to the ebooks, and load up on the future.
Hey everyone, it's David Afsharirad back here on the Baen Free Radio Hour to talk about a new anthology I edited for Baen. This is the first and best all Davids anthology. It is called The Chronicles of Davids, and it is out now in ebook and trade paperback. Collecting 15 tales of science fiction and fantasy, these are stories with maximum Dave. Joining me here on the podcast are several other Davids. But first I want to talk a little bit about how the book came about. This is the thing I've told people, the title of the book and the concept, that it's called The Chronicles of Davids, and everyone in the book, with a few exceptions, which I'll talk about in a moment, has David somewhere in his name. And people usually chuckle, say something like, man, that's great, but then they also have this look like, who in the world came up with that idea? And the answer is a man you've heard here on the podcast in the past, that is Christopher Rocchio, who is a science fiction author, and he's also edited several books at Baen. And he has also, he's an associate editor at Baen Books. And I was hanging out with Christopher at DragonCon, and he was the one that we were talking about so many people at Baen are named David. There's me. And then the gentlemen, several of whom on the call, David Weber, of course, David Drake. You've heard of these people. And we were laughing about it. And Christopher said, we should do an anthology. You could edit it, and we'll get David Mattingly to do the cover. And we laughed about it. We thought this is very funny. Ha ha. But then Christopher was at LibertyCon, I think, the next year. And he may have had some liquid encouragement. I'm not sure. I can't speak to that specifically. I was not there. But he was at a room party with Baen publisher Tony Weiskopf. And he said, Tony, let me tell you this idea I've got. And then later on, I'm on a phone call with Tony Weiskopf about something completely unrelated. And we're getting off the call, and she says, oh, and by the way, we need to talk about the Davids book you're going to do. And that was when I officially got the job as editor of The Chronicles of Davids, science fiction and fantasy with maximum Dave. And we decided Baen had a lot of Davids, not quite enough to fill an entire book, although we could have come close. But there are so many Davids in the broader science fiction and fantasy field. And I emailed a bunch of them, and everybody's reaction was, that's so weird, I'm in. And so that is how the Chronicles of Davids came about. Christopher unfortunately could not be in the book. I asked him, his middle name is Paul, so he doesn't really have the credentials to be in the book, but he was the one who came up with the idea and showed us the way. So that is how the Chronicles of Davids came about. I'm sure you were all had a burning desire to know that, and now you do. So now I'd like to meet the Daves that we have here on the call. And although I know all these gentlemen and we've interacted socially, it's going to be kind of formal. I think I'm going to have to call everyone Mr. and then their last name, because otherwise this call is going to be just going to be bedlam. So first up we have Mr. David Boop. He is a Denver-based speculative fiction author and editor. He is the author of She Murdered Me with Science, A Whisper to a Scheme, and The Soul Changers, among many other things. He is probably best known around these parts as the editor of the Weird Western series of anthologies from Baen, including Straight Out of Tombstone, Straight Out of Deadwood, and Straight Out of Dodge City. The first two titles in that series are out now, I believe, or the first one certainly is, and the second one, if it's not out now, will be out soon. Dave, you can...
October 1st. It came out October 1st.
Okay, so it is out now. Awesome. Okay. And then the third one will be out next year. So, Mr. David Booth, thank you so much for being on.
Thank you for having me, David. Really appreciate it. Straight Out of Dodge City comes out February 4th.
All right. Excellent. We will look forward to that. Next up, DJ Butler grew up in swamps, deserts, and mountains. After messing around for years with the practice of law, he finally got serious and turned to his lifelong passion of storytelling. He now writes adventure stories for readers of all ages, plays guitar, and spends as much time as he can with his family. He is the author of, among several other novels and short stories, Witchy Eye, Witchy Winter, and Witchy Kingdom from Baen Books, as well as the forthcoming The Cunning Man with Aaron Michael Ritchie, and also the forthcoming In the Palace of Shadow and Joy. DJ Butler, is it true that your first name is actually Daniel and you lied to me so that you could be in this anthology and told me it was David?
That's an outrageous, filthy lie, but it is true that I would have, because upon hearing such a glorious idea, who would not have ventured so far as to legally change his name to be in this anthology?
Well, hey, there you go. Next up, we have David B. Coe. You may also know him as D.B. Jackson. He is the author of more than 20 novels and as many short stories. As D.B. Jackson, he is the author of Time's Children and Time's Demons, books 1 and 2 in the I Lavale cycle. Dave, you're going to have to correct me on that. As well as as well as the Thief Taker Chronicles, a historical fantasy set in pre-revolutionary Boston. As David B. Coe, he is here as David B. Coe. He has written epic fantasies and media tie-ins, and also the case files of Justice Fearson, the story of which we'll be talking about tonight is set in that world. He's best known for the Crawford Award-winning Lon Tobin Chronicle and the Justice Fearson stuff. I don't know if you're best known for that, but you're best known for that or probably on this podcast. So, David B. Coe, Mr. D.B. Jackson, thank you so much for being here.
It's a pleasure for both of us. It's great to be here, and I'm really pleased to be part of the project. And it's nice to have a new venue for a Justice Fearson story.
And last but not least, from just down the road from me in Austin, Texas, we have David Hardy. He is the author of Crazy Greta, Palmetto Empire, and numerous Western historical and adventure stories. He is also, I believe, working on a novel that is set in the world of his story that we're going to talk about today. He will correct me if I'm wrong about that. David Hardy, thanks so much for being on.
Thank you for having me. It's quite an honor. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, I think actually being in Chronicles of Davids might be my actual claim to fame, because my other novels have tended to fly under the radar.
Well, yeah, you do. As you said, you said, I'm very commercially minded. I write Western short stories in the 21st century. So we hope that this will get some eyeballs on your stuff. However we can help. I think it's looking to be differentiated. That's terrific.
Dedication to art. That's what it's all about, right?
Yeah. You're not in it for crass lucre.
Exactly.
But if you have any crass lucre,
I'll throw it your way.
Let's see. Let's start with Dave Butler. Why not? I mentioned The Cunning Man, which is a new novel that you co-wrote with Aaron Michael Ritchie. And Hiram Woolley is the main character in that novel, and he is the main character in your story in the Chronicles of Davids. And I want to talk about him in just a second, but first I want to talk about that title of yours. I think we can say it on the air. We're a podcast, so we're not under the thumb of the FCC. It's The Seven Nipples of Molly Kitchen is the name of the story. Could you tell us what the title refers to and how you came to that provocative name there?
My dad actually told me, my dad was my scoutmaster for a few years when I was a teenager. And he told me years and years ago, hey, that mountain over there at the south end of the valley is named Molly's Nipple. And I thought, that's hilarious. Much more recently, about 2 years ago, I learned that actually the state of Utah has at least 7 and possibly as many as 11 mountains and also a well, all named Molly's Nipple. And they were named Molly's Nipple by the same guy, who was a guy named John Kitchen, who is we're talking about like the 1840s and 50s, right? So Brigham Young was sort of he ruled by fiat around here, and he sent John Kitchen out to go exploring, and John did, and everywhere he went, he named things Molly's nipple. Now this is the real world. So it remains the case if you're driving south out of Utah Valley with your Google Maps on, and you're watching names appear on your phone, Molly's nipple will pop up on the left-hand side. And so the question arises, right? Who is Molly? And we have no idea. It turns out the records were not very good from that period. Presumably a woman he knew, right? So I'd had this fact in my head for a while, and then when I started writing stories about Hiram Woolley, who was a 1930s wizard who was from Utah, I knew at some point I was going to have to write a story called The Seven Nipples of Molly Kitchen. And when I learned I was going to be in an anthology alongside names like David Hardy and David Bicot and David Boop, I said, okay, this is my chance. The readers of these guys are never going to read me unless I put something really provocative on the title page. So then I had to figure out a story to go with the title.
And this is, I believe, you've written several stories about Hiram Woolley, but I think this is the first one in print.
Correct.
Yes, so is a world debut in the Chronicles of David.
Beating me by exactly 1 month.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, because I also have a Hiram Woolley story straight out of Deadwood that I asked David for, Mr. Butler for, and you beat me by a month. I will never forgive you.
I slipped Marla and Tony some money. I said I can't have David Boop scoop me on Hiram Woolley, put me a month ahead of him on the Baen schedule, and it worked.
Very good. Very good. I will keep that in mind for the future.
So, Dave Butler, let's talk about Hiram Woolley. You mentioned a little bit he's a wizard in the 30s in Utah, but kind of flesh out his character a little bit for the listeners.
So he's and this is a time of real transition nationally and in the state of Utah. And Hiram is a deeply liminal character. He has a feat in sort of in opposed worlds in lots of ways. So he's a Mormon sugar beet farmer, born in the 19th century. His father's a polygamist. He does not realize this. He's the only child of his mother, and he doesn't know why his father's not around till the day his father shows up to tell him that we're going to Mexico and you don't get to come, and abandons him and his mother. And his mother shortly afterward disappears, and Hiram doesn't actually know what happened to his mother. So he grows up on his grandma Hetty's sugar beet farm in Lehi, Utah, learning farming from her and also learning her traditional magical lore. So this is a story about a wizard or in some ways, it's about a paladin. It's about a kind of a guy who really wants to do good. And one of the fun things about it has been virtually 100% of the magic that's in the book and in the 3 or 4 stories that are coming out about now is taken from real historical sources. It's kinds of things that actual English practitioners in the so-called cunning man tradition really did. So Hiram carries a bloodstone in his pocket to prevent his being deceived, and he wears a Cairo medallion, an iron medallion with the symbol Cairo and the inscription In Hoc Signo Vinces to protect him from harm, and practices divination by the dissolving of clay balls by sieve and shears and other he wouldn't even acknowledge the word spells, other craft, other charms.
Yeah, so we've mentioned there's been, I think, 3 or 4 short stories now, and you co-wrote the novel with Aaron Michael Ritchie, which is coming out, I think, November. Do you know for sure? I'm trying to remember.
I got a box of them, yesterday.
All right, very cool. So I just wonder, it's very smart from a marketing standpoint. We're talking about our genius marketing of an all Davids anthology and writing westerns in the 21st century and all this. But it is smart from a marketing standpoint to write about these stories about your series character. Hopefully, someone will the people reading Chronicles of Davids will pick up The Cunning Man, and maybe vice versa. But I wonder, for more artistic reasons, too, does it help you to understand? And actually, David Coe, why don't you jump in on this too, since you've got a story, Justice Fearson, this is one of your series characters. Does it help you to understand your characters and the world you've created to write these side stories? How does that maybe help you as a writer or as a world builder or character creator to take these little side jaunts? And Dave Butler, why don't you start, and maybe David Coe if you want to weigh in, and anyone else if you've got thoughts on that as well.
Sure.
Yeah, so we were writing the novel and these stories sort of contemporaneously, or at least, in between the first draft of the novel and then the revisions of the novel, I wrote the stories. And yeah, I found it helpful to kind of explore ideas about, so Hiram's a widower and a Great War veteran, and he there are no romantic relationships in the novel. The principal character relationship between him and his adopted Navajo son. And so the short stories let me try out some ideas about how old the son really should be in the 30s to get the dynamic I wanted, and what kinds of solutions Hiram might attempt. His solution in The Seven Nipples of Molly Kitchen is not a magical one. It's sort of a medical solution. So yeah, it was useful. Almost like writing little exploratory drafts.
Yeah, I find it's really helpful in several ways. It lets me explore elements of the character that I might not get to in a novel. It allows me to play with the world a little bit and get a feel for my setting. It's really helpful with voice when I'm trying to kind of perfect that unique sound that you want in your narrator. And the Justice Fearson books are all first-person narrator. And so getting that voice right is really essential for the success of a story or a book. And I find that the short stories are wonderful for practicing that and for improving my feel as a writer for what I'm doing when I sit down to work on a longer piece like a novel. It's also something that I recommend when I'm teaching to starting writers, because it allows us to learn more about our characters and our worlds and our voice, and it gives us something to sell when we're still working on the novel. And for beginning writers, it's much easier to move a novel if you have a short story sale or 2 or 3 under your belt from working on these shorter pieces. So to me, it's a win-win-win situation. There is no shortcoming. There's no drawback to playing with short fiction on a character who's going to be the star of a novel.
David Boop or Dave Hardy. Dave Hardy, I believe you're writing a novel set in this world. Was the short story something that came, and I want to talk to you more about that in a second, did this short story come first and you thought, maybe I should do more with that? Or how did that, where are you in that process? Maybe you don't want to talk about it, you don't want to jinx it, I'm not sure.
No problem. No, A Servant of the Protector definitely came first. I was thinking of it as a concept, trying to write sort of my homage to space opera. And I was thinking about what's one of the core elements is that kind of superhero type, the lensman. Yet at the same time, he's sort of bound to a social order that he has to defend. And from there, I took a little idea from Barrington Bailey's Pillars of Eternity, where the protagonist, Joachim Boaz, has his entire skeleton filled with computer processing devices, so that he literally is a walking computer, capable of comprehending everything around him and acting on it. So I thought that was kind of fascinating, and yet I realized that you can't, the emerging culture that we've got in terms of computer use is the network, is everything's connected. So at what point, if you cram your superhero full of cybernetics, is he really himself? Is he just like a machine attached to a bigger network and controlled? And bizarrely enough, that led me to my novel. It was sort of a follow-up on this. It was actually a science fiction retelling of the saga of King Hythric the Wise, which is a kind of a traditional Viking saga about a goth king and his cursed sword, sometimes called the Turving saga. And I thought, well, what if the sword wasn't just cursed, but the sword was a cybernetic attachment to the king, to that individual? How do those two people interrelate? And of course, in the back of my mind was H.B. Piper's classic space Viking story. So basically, you give me an opening and it just all comes out, Lensman, H.B. Piper, with a little bit of cyberpunk thrown in. I'm actually working on another novel also set in that, which develops, again, kind of going back to some of the stuff that Doc Smith wrote about. His Lensmen, they're kind of fascinating. In an early, one of the early Lensman novels, they mentioned, oh yeah, we got to deal with the wizards from, the North Pole of Jupiter. And I thought, oh my God, what a great idea. But then they're taking on space pirates and interplanetary drug dealers. And, this is just catnip for me. I mean, space pirates, drug dealers. So, and of course, my, years and years of reading about pirates of, every kind of stripe ever, not to mention, the, modern, sagas of, gangsters and drug dealers like TV's Narcos. I thought, okay, this is a fertile field. So yeah, it's kind of that's kind of what I'm interested in. Now, of course, at the core of it is kind of the concept. My short story is titled "The Servant of the Protector," and it's about the servant, individuals who are kind of cybernetically adapted to be warriors as part of this galactic empire, and so they tend to be rather driven persons when they're given a mission, and yet at the same time they sort of have to reflect on what humanity around them is like and how they are different because they remain humans.
Yeah, I really. Let's just segue in, and I was going to segue into Justice Fearsome, but I'm going to segue into Servant of the Protector, and we'll bounce back to David Coate. You mentioned a lot of this stuff just in this on the podcast already, but you and I have talked about it, which is one thing I love about your story is that it's got a real pulp era feel to it. And we've talked a lot about our shared love for, like, in quotes, the good old stuff, the pulp days. And I just wanted to get your take and anyone else's take on, like, what is it about those stories from that era that, like, Howard and Burroughs and Doc Smith and Jack Williamson and all these that are living on. Princess of Mars is over 100 years old now, and I'll still meet people who just read it just for fun. It's not in a class or something. And I know you write westerns too, which had a big pulp tradition. And I just wonder, what is it about those stories that appeals to you, and that you think that they're still finding an audience in either their work or work that's inspired by it?
I love the adventure genre in all of its phases because it is it's a genre that allows a storyteller to talk about primal things. The individual who has to accomplish something. And it can be, maybe it's taking down an interstellar drug network. Maybe it's rescuing somebody from a horrible captivity. But that focus on individuals who are driven to accomplish something. And I think it differs from a lot of other genres, which isn't to say that other genres aren't bad or the literary fiction is bad, but it has a primal ring to it. If it's, you can write some really, really great stuff about, somebody reflecting on how bad their childhood was or something like that. But, does it have that universal connection? Because, adventure, like I say, it's really primal. It's very basic because in the end, we all know we're individuals who have drives to accomplish things.
Yeah, I think that answered it well. And one thing I think is clear from your writing, at least what I've read of it, is that I appreciate. And again, I mean, like, I can get into some navel-gazing literary fiction too. You got to be in the right mood, but that's fine. But I think I really like that the story moves. Like, it's got like it. I cannot remember who it was. A.E. Van Vogt, maybe. Somebody said, like, someone jump in and correct me here, but he was like, every 8,000 words you should have, like, an explosion or something like that, right? Where just you
all
keep...
spells have a man walk through the door with a gun.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Chandler. Yeah. Well, it's there's something really basic about conflict, because conflict is what drives stories. And, if you're being chased by interstellar drug dealers armed with plasma pistols, hell, you got
There's
some conflict there.
Yeah.
You could also say that there's something very archetypal, right? I mean, I think that the great thing about adventure fiction is it grabs the archetypes directly by which our unconscious mind has always organized the categories of experience. And so I think actually often the challenge with navel-gazing literary fiction is that it doesn't do that, and it becomes an exercise in verbal virtuosity or descriptiveness, but doesn't actually give people the psychic tools that a story out of the Brothers Grimm or by Louis L'Amour would.
Yeah, I'm gonna add to that by the idea that, when we look at narrative historically, sometimes we just want to be able to step away from our own world and spend time in somebody else's. And if that world is too much like our own, where the characters are dealing with some of the same stuff that we're dealing with every day, yeah, sometimes that can be very cathartic to feel like somebody else has experienced what we've experienced. But sometimes we don't want to experience what we're experiencing. Sometimes we need to give our brain a rest. And when we look at the classic pulp era, when it came into existence, we were dealing with Depression era and war and stuff like that. And people didn't want to think about what their day-to-day life was like. They wanted to escape. And, escapist fiction is a tried and true type of fiction that it's good to play in from time to time. It doesn't mean that we can't bring some of the pathos back to the Greek tragedies. There are plenty of deep characters in pulp, but that doesn't mean that those characters are always having to deal with that depth. I mean, we go to work, 5 days out of the week. We may only be challenged emotionally one of those days. We may only have one bad day out of 4, which means the rest of the days we're doing our job. And pulp is like that. Some days the hero has to go, why am I still doing this job? Whereas the other days are like, oh my God, aliens are invading and I've got to save the planet again.
David Coe, let's circle back to you. After that, I don't have anything to add. That was a great discussion on the importance of pulp literature, I think. But let's circle back and talk a little bit about Justice Fearson. And you've probably been on the podcast talking about all three of the 3 books in the series are Spellblind, His Father's Eyes, and Shadow's Blade. And you've probably talked about them before, but it's probably been a minute. So if you could, just sort of give us a window into the Justice Fearson world for the listeners.
Yeah, the Justice Fearson books, they're not reminiscent of pulp. They're actually reminiscent of noir, which I think of as being related and kind of almost contemporaries of pulp stuff. But it's also a harkening back to a different time and a different sort of storytelling, more the Dashiell Hammett, Raymond Chandler approach. But these are detective novels with a magical element. My lead character, and some of his closest friends and most dangerous enemies are what are known as weremists. And so every month on the full moon, they kind of go insane. Their magic strengthens, but their minds weaken and they can't control their magic. It's almost a Jekyll Hyde thing. So he's able to use his magic throughout a month, but on those 3 days around the full moon and the day before and after, he loses his mind. And over time, those moon phasings are taking a toll and driving him permanently insane, as they did his father, who's a recurring character in the books. And so every book kind of has, and every story, including this story, Long Night's, I believe it's called Long Night's Moon.
It is, yes.
In this, I've forgotten the title. But all of the stories have this kind of ticking clock, because invariably the full moon is bearing down on him, and he has only so much time to get through whatever mystery it is he's trying to solve before everything goes to hell on him. And this was a really fun story to write. It was set actually, I think, slightly before Spellblind, the first book in the series, in the chronology of Jay Fearson's development. This is really the first episode that readers get of him. And he's solving a fairly mundane mystery, but in the course of doing that, he's forced to kind of stare down and beat down this gang of young upstart weremists who are kind of rabble-rousing and playing with powers that they don't quite understand. And he's forced to come in as kind of this grizzled veteran and say, whoa there, guys, you need to learn your stuff before you're going to do this. As I said, it was a really fun story to write. But it's all about the noir stuff. I really, with the Fearson, with the Thief Taker books I write as D.B. Jackson, with a couple of other things I've done, I love mysteries, and I love hearkening back to that noir period, that voice of a detective, kind of hard-boiled and stripped away of some of the flowery language that maybe works its way into some of my epic fantasies. These are grittier books, and they're really fun to write, and I hope they're really fun to read. I certainly have enjoyed going through them and reading others who write in a similar vein to kind of learn my chops while I was getting ready to write these stories and books.
Yeah, I'm sure I've said it to all of you or most of you in person, and I've probably said it on this podcast. I'm a huge mystery crime fan, and particularly the hard-boiled and noir genre. So I've always liked the Justice Fearson stuff. And I should mention the Chronicles of Davids, just for those of you who are going, hey, hang on a second. It is primarily news stories. I I'd have to get. I couldn't do it. I'd have to look at the numbers, but it's mostly new. But there were a few reprints in it. Some because the authors have passed away in 2 cases, and then there's a couple. And David Coe, yours is one of them. This was a story that was originally on Baen.com, and I'd asked you because I wanted you to be in the book, but you had like deadlines upon deadlines upon deadlines. So
yeah, it was.
So this is a reprint, but we're glad to have it.
I'm writing a new Justice Fearson story right now for the Baen LibertyCon anthology that'll be out next spring.
Oh, great! Yeah, this is Give Me LibertyCon, and I'm sure we'll talk about that on the podcast. But yeah, it's all Baen writers, and it's going. Part of the proceeds are going to a charity in honor of. Now I can't remember. Timmy Bolgio, Uncle Timmy.
Yeah, Timmy Bolgio and the Literacy Project in Chattanooga.
Yeah, oh, that's great. So Justice Fearson rides again. Okay, great.
Justice Fearson rides again. That's right.
David Boop, let's talk about Lyman Gilmore Jr.'s Impossible Dream. I got the title right. This is the other thing as I was putting this together, I realized that so this is this is sort of a weird Western, and I realized that everyone we're talking to today, we all these stories sort of have a almost like a Western or a hard boiled or a pulp era feel, and a lot of the book is that, but there is some stuff I should mention that's not. This is maybe not the most representative sample, although I'm glad we could get this going. But we do have stuff that is in the book that is sort of that it doesn't have that feel to it too. I tried to get a real wide range of things, from high fantasy to kind of more absurdist stuff to military science fiction, and some humor in there too. But so I just want to say that. But I love these stories that do have that feel that we're talking about today. And David Boop, your story is sort of a weird Western, and it is at the same time based on a true story in a way. So could you tell us a little bit about it?
Well, we could make the comment that those authors in the book that are writing military sci-fi and epic sci-fi and space opera are too busy with all of their money, and the people who write weird westerns and noir have the time to be on the podcast. But I'm not going to make that comment. We'll leave that for the audience to decide. So.
Well, some of them are dead too. That's why they're not on. Anyways, go ahead.
Lyman Gilmore Jr. Was a real person in this story. He was a gentleman out in California, right before the end of the 19th century, who invented a steam-powered airplane that flew almost a mile a good year before the Wright brothers. The problem was twofold. Number one, he was not able to accurately record this. He was not actually able to prove this. And then number two, it was by the time he got everything to Washington to the patent office, the Wright brothers were already on the way. So he missed his opportunity to be the inventor of the modern airplane. So instead, Lyman Gilmore Jr., being the industrious person that he is, invented the world's first commercial airport because he knew that those planes would have to land somewhere. And so he is known in history for that. So he's an interesting character. I stumbled across a book, a little biography on him, a little micro press, and I was reading this guy, and I was just fascinated by him. And there is, for those of you guys who don't know, there's this thing called the mysterious airship, or the Great Airship of 1893, which is in California and other places along the Pacific, these people had this vision or the sighting of an airship, which, when you look at the description, sounds like a modern, Boeing, jet, airplane. They describe it as being silver. They describe it as having the wings. They describe passengers in it looking out of windows, which, of course, nothing was like that available at the time. And there are all sorts of books written about it. But Lyman Gilmore was one of these people. He had a vision, and he started building that airplane. If you look him up, he's a fascinating character. There's lots of things. And I thought about his whole quest with this, with building this airplane, and the visions and the borderline kind of craziness that goes along with being a man of vision or person of vision of any sort. And I thought, he's got a very Quixote-esque story to him, plus steam-powered airplane, very steampunk, very weird Western. And he lived at a time where a lot of these things are set. So I made a Quixote-esque story where he builds his plane and he has to fight actual dragons.
Sorry, my mic was on mute. Okay, yeah, and I want to tell a quick story about this because I was not aware. I learned just now that he invented the airport. So thank you for that informative bit of information. But I did not know he was. I think you had told me he was a real guy and he'd kind of been working on a plan. But I didn't know all the timing that you just laid out. And we had a really thorough and very good copy editor on this book, and who was a history buff. And he came to me with the copy edits for your story, and saying like, I don't think this guy might need to work on his dates because this doesn't make you can't have him flying a plane now because that's a year before the Wright brothers. And I thought, oh no, Dave, he didn't get the dates right. It's probably an easy fix. I hope he's not too upset. And then you told me this. Actually, this happened. This guy actually did fly a plane, according to some accounts, a year before the Wright brothers. So, yeah, it's a little piece of hidden history about that. You do that a little. I don't know this a lot, but you've done that before, where you take sort of a secret history or a side history. Do you go out looking for those things, or is it sort of just you're naturally drawn to these weird little tidbits, and then your mind starts working on them? How does that work?
Both, actually. Yeah. Yes. I call it going down the rabbit hole. When I start researching something, sometimes that research will take me in places that I wasn't expecting. When I was writing a second Noel Glass story, the character in She Murdered Me with Science, which dealt with trying to build a sentient robot in 1955, I started really exploring some things about robot like rights and stuff like that, just because I wanted to understand robotics a little bit more. And I picked up a lot of books and so forth, which led me to write a near future science fiction story about a sentient robot and dealing with personal rights. So sometimes research in another era will take me, to the past or all the way to the future. It just really depends on what I discover when I'm down the rabbit hole. And unfortunately, sometimes that will distract from the writing, but I always come up with a lot of really interesting material that I save for a later time. This is Lyman Gilmore Jr.'s Impossible Dream is set in my Drowned Horse Chronicle. And to date, there's been 19 Drowned Horse stories and 2 reprints, but there's on slate to be 30. And so when I do research for a Drowned Horse story, I tend to find things that I can use later. So yeah, It's fun. I'll set that a little aside, or I'll go, oh, I want to read more about that, and I'll order the book, a research book on it, and tuck it to the side until I need to write another drowned horse story, and then I'll start cracking out open what I've discovered in previous researches. But yes, it's a fun. I love it. I love the idea of secret history.
Yeah, well, gentlemen, we could probably keep talking all night, but I want to probably wrap it up there, if I may. I do want to mention a couple of the other people, or everyone else in the book, just briefly. There's a David Weber story. This is one of the reprints. This is set in the Bolo universe. The anthology kicks off with a brand new David Drake story set in his RCN series. There's a Hank Davis story. I'll talk about that in just a second. Dave Freer wrote a science fiction story. Let me see. David Carrico wrote sort of a pretty brutal kind of epic fantasy tale. Dave Barra is in here. Avram Davidson. D.L. Young wrote sort of he calls it sort of Hal 9000 meets Ed Wood story of Hollywood in the near future. And then there's a reprint by David H. Keller, the old pulp era. This is a story from 1930 that I think may have been in Weird Tales. I can't remember now. But I do want to mention one other thing. I said this is an all Davids anthology that's sort of with a wink and a nudge. There are 3 guys in here that don't really have David anywhere in their name, and I want to address that, and then we'll wrap it up. The first is Gregory Benford. That's because he co-wrote a story with David Brin that I really liked called I Could Have Done Better. And I thought, well, he's a David by association then. And then another one is Hank Davis, who you've probably heard on the podcast in the past. He's works for Baen. He's editor emeritus, and he edits a lot of Baen's reprint anthologies. And we figured, well, S is right next to D on the QWERTY keyboard, so we like Hank, we'll let him in. And then the last one is the hardest one to justify, which is Barry in Malsberg, right? You can't even think maybe his middle name is David because he puts the N in there. And the way that happened was I'd asked David Drake to be in the anthology, and he's good friends with Barry Malsberg. And I get David Drake says he'll do it, and I get an email from David Drake later saying, Barry Malsberg wants to write a story for this, and I told him he could. Hope that's okay. Well, I'm not good. It's too late now. But even so, I'm a big fan of David Drake, and I'm a really big fan of Barry Malsberg. He was one of the writers that I kind of first noticed when I started reading science fiction and fantasy and crime and horror stories. You know, his name would pop up a lot in stories that I liked. And so I thought, this is a great opportunity to edit Barry in Malsberg. Not edit him, I didn't really edit him much, but to help publish Barry Malsberg for sure, even though it doesn't make much sense. Well, turns out Barry Malsberg misunderstood what the anthology was. A few years back, you guys may remember, Baen did a David Drake tribute anthology. And it was stories, David Drake was character in some were set in his universes that he created. And Barry Malsberg somehow thought that we were doing another one. And so he wanted to write a story for that. And so he did. He wrote a story called an epilogue, The House of David, and it's sort of I don't know if it's correct to say it's about David Drake, but it works as sort of a David Drake tribute and plays. It's a really powerful story, and every character in it is named David. So that is why Barry in Malsberg is on the cover of a book called The Chronicles of Davids. So I wanted to wrap up with that because people have been asking me, and now it is on the record. So we've been talking about The Chronicles of Davids. It is out now, as I said, in ebook format and trade paperback from Baen Books. It's been out about a month, so you should already own it. And if you don't, run out and buy multiple copies. It is the perfect gift for everyone in your life named David and everyone in your life not named David. I want to thank all the Davids who have been on the podcast with me. And I want one last thing. The cover art is done by David Mattingly. So it is David's through and through with those exceptions I just noted. So I want to thank the Davids who have been on talking about the book and their stories. DJ Dave Butler, David Boop, David B. Coe, and David Hardy. Thank you, gentlemen, so much for being part of the anthology and for talking here on the podcast.
Thank you for having us.
Pleasure. Thanks for having us.
Thanks very much, David.
Now we continue with the complete audiobook serialization of Son of the Black Sword by Larry Correia, Book 1 in the Saga of the Forgotten Warrior. After the War of the Gods, the demons were cast out and fell to the world. Mankind was nearly eradicated by the seemingly unstoppable beasts, until the gods sent the great hero Ram Rowan to save them. He united the tribes, gave them magic, and drove the demons into the sea. But as centuries passed, the descendants of the great hero grew in number and power. They became tyrannical and cruel, and their religion nothing but an excuse for greed. The people rose up, and the surviving royalty and their priests were made casteless, condemned to live as untouchables. The age of law had begun. Ashok Vidal has been chosen by a powerful ancient weapon to be its bearer. He is a protector, a member of an ancient military order of roving law enforcers. No one is more merciless in rooting out those who secretly practice the old ways as Ashok. But Ashok isn't who he thinks he is. And when he finds himself on the wrong side of the law, the consequences lead to rebellion, war, and perhaps transformation. Now here is the latest entry in Larry Correia's Son of the Black Sword.
Chapter 40. There was a wide drainage ditch cut through the town, separating the casteless quarter from the homes of the whole men. The ditch had been filled by the torrential rains and partially iced over during the night. The only way across was an old stone bridge that was completely covered in thick ice. Ashok crossed with an untouchable child cradled in each arm, and his bare feet leaving a smear of blood with each step. The girl had passed out. The boy was still crying. They weighed nothing. All of Jarlang seemed dirty and run down, but this quarter was far worse. The workers' roofs were made of shingles, the castelesses of straw. There was no order here, just haphazard buildings stacked deeper and deeper until there were only narrow channels for bodies to pass through. The workers' main street was paved with stone. The casteless didn't have an open space wide enough to call a street. And the path Ashok found himself on was nothing but ruts and frozen mud puddles. Always on the lookout for trouble, the casteless had seen him coming and gone into hiding. They probably didn't know what to make of a whole man in a fine merchant's coat carrying two of their own, so they'd retreated. He saw frightened eyes peeking out from behind slats. "Who's in charge?" Ashok's shout broke the early morning stillness. The sound startled a stray dog from beneath a pile of rotting timbers, and it ran away, tail between its legs. "Come out!" He continued through the maze, shouting. If they didn't answer soon, he'd pick a shack and leave the children inside. That thought angered him, and he wasn't even certain why. The barracks didn't have doors, just curtains made of hide. One of those curtains parted, and a hunched-over female came hobbling out, using a knotted old stick for a cane. Her hair was wild and white, her skin was yellowed and had the same texture as the leather curtains. She stopped a few feet from Ashok, and he thought that she looked so brittle that if a strong wind pushed her over, she might shatter. "These folks heed me." Her voice was stronger than her appearance suggested it would be. There was something too proud about this one. She wore her rags like a Thakur would wear their finest silks. "I'm Mother Dawn." Castless don't have titles. "Mother is more of a nickname than a title." Her eyes were so clouded and grey that Ashok thought she might be blind, but then she looked right at the children in Ashok's arms. "Poor little things." "I saved these." "How unexpectedly kind of you." Ashok had never been accused of kindness before. "Take them." Then she put her fingers to her lips and whistled. It was a surprisingly sharp noise. Another curtain opened, and two casteless women hurried over to Ashok and relieved him of the bodies. For a reason he couldn't begin to understand, he was hesitant to let go. "I assure you they'll be tended to." He relented, and the meagre weight was lifted from him. Ashok watched as they were taken inside a barracks, and the curtain closed. It was over. Ashok owed the casteless no explanation and turned to go. "We've been expecting you." Ashok kept walking. "You know nothing of who I am." "You are four." He paused. "All of the youngsters speak of you at night. In the barracks, where their overseers can't hear. Some don't believe, but others do. It has been a long time since we've had a hero." "Hero is an inappropriate description. Command them to stop." "I'm not talking about these here, but all of us. Word of your existence has travelled across all the houses to every barracks and slum. It is good to have a new story. The few of us who've lived long enough to get old have been telling the ancient stories, hoping the day will come. And if we hope hard enough, sometimes the forgotten shows us things. He showed me you would come here." Ashok's curiosity got the better of him. "What did your false god have to say about me?" "Say?" The crazy old casteless cackled. "I'm no oracle." "I don't know what that is." "A title from the old days. Prophet, I suppose they call it nowadays, though I think that's just inexperienced keepers mixing up jobs. I've not heard the voice. I don't get the words. Couldn't write them down even if I did, so why waste perfectly good words on someone who can't read or write like me? I got no keeper here to scribble them down. Everybody knows an oracle always has a keeper in tow. How else would the Forgotten's words get recorded for his people?" He shrugged. "But I saw. The gods showed me two paths. You take one, we all die. You take the other, we live for a bit. But you might not." It weren't clear. Ashok studied the crone's milky eyes. "No wonder." "Two paths before you fall. Before you pick, know there are 500 of our kind here, innocent. And we'll all be punished for what you've done. Our only use in Jarlang is to work the terraces. Everything else is above us. No terraces to work during the winter, but we still eat up the food stores. Only this was a poor year, and there's not enough food. The workers don't like going hungry to keep us around. Spring's a way off still. Winter's long. They won't need much other excuse to kill off most of us. And you just gave them one." There was shouting on the other side of the bridge. He called upon the heart to focus his senses. Some villagers were telling the tale of the beaten workers, trying to rile up the others. Angry cries echoed through Jarlang. "It is not right for them to punish you for something I did." Ashok muttered. We are all still being punished for something our ancestors did, hundreds and hundreds of years ago. This comes as a surprise." There was a clang, clang, clang noise as a villager began beating on a kettle. That would serve as their alarm. Retribution had to be sought. Justice demands blood. These two paths you saw, where did each one lead? Both end in blood. You are born into this world to kill. That can't be helped, Fall. The question is, whose blood will you spill first? Gather your friends and flee, or stay and fight? Will you help your brothers and sisters here live? Or will you abandon us to the mob so that you can continue to pretend to be something you are not? I don't want to hurt these workers. Workers? The mother tilted her head to the side. If only it were so easy. We can hide from workers until their rage cools. We have far more patience than they do. No, Fall. I was shown that something much worse is coming. The Forgotten doesn't care how many innocents must perish to convince you, only that you are convinced. Of the many different gods the tribes worshipped back in the old days, I have been told that some of them were merciful, even kind and loving. The Forgotten was not one of those. More noise was coming from the worker side of the village. Angry cries for vengeance were answered. Clubs banged a rhythm against walls. They were coming. The law demanded that he continue on his way. He may have made a foolish, emotional mistake getting involved earlier, but orders came first. Now he had time to think clearly, and he knew he had to get to Akershan and find the prophet. But Ashok couldn't move, torn between duty and something else. Shame? Doubt? He didn't know what to call it, but the unfamiliar emotion gnawed at him. He looked around the humble, castless quarter and knew that if he did what he was supposed to, this place and its inhabitants would be reduced to ash. Yes, Fall. Life would have remained simpler if you would have just let those children die. Only I didn't. He started for the bridge. She called after him. The Forgotten didn't show me that he'd picked someone too dumb to wear shoes after a nice storm. I was in a hurry.
That was another entry in the complete audiobook serialization of Son of the Black Sword by Larry Correia. And that's it for the podcast. Thanks to Audible.com. Extreme thanks to Baen consulting editor David Afsharirad for conducting a great roundtable, and to podcast theme composer Ruth Judkowitz. And a fairy ring of toadstools big enough to accommodate the large folk and their minions, plus copious drams of mead and really good pour-over ambrosia, plus thanks, praise, and Daves to DJ Butler, David Boop, David B. Coe, and David Hardy. Authors in The Chronicles of Davids, edited by David Afsharirad. Please join us next time here at the hammering heart of science fiction and fantasy, and keep reaching for the stars.